1. They say that Cicero's mother Helvia was of good family and conversation, but as to his father the accounts are in opposite extremes. For some say that the man was born and brought up in a fuller's workshop, but others carry back his pedigree to Tullus Attius, who reigned with distinction among the Volsci and fought against the Romans with no small vigor. However, the first of the family who got the name of Cicero must have been a man of note, and this was the reason why his descendants did not reject the name, but were well pleased with it, though it was a matter of jeering to many. For the Latins call a vetch Cicer, and the first Cicero had at the end of his nose a cleft or split, slightly marked, as we may suppose, like the cleft in a vetch, whence he got the name. Indeed, Cicero himself, the subject of this life, on his friends advising him when he was first a candidate for office, and began to engage in public life, to get rid of the name and take another, is reported to have boldly replied that he would strive to make the name of Cicero more glorious than that of Scaurus and Catulus. While he was quaestor in Sicily, and causing a silver offering to the gods to be made, he had inscribed on it his first two names, Marcus and Tullius. But in place of the third, he jocosely ordered the artist to cut the figure of a vetch by the side of the characters. This, then, is what is recorded about the name. 2. They say that Cicero's mother gave birth to him after a painless and easy labor, on the 3rd day of the new calends, on which the magistrates now offer up prayers and sacrifices on behalf of the emperor. It is said that a vision appeared to his nurse and foretold her that she was nurturing a great blessing for all Romans. Such things as these are generally considered to be mere dreams and idle talk, but in his case Cicero soon showed that it was a real prophecy when he was of age to be taught, for he was conspicuous for his natural talent and got a name and reputation among the boys, so that their fathers used to visit the schools out of desire to see Cicero and to inquire of his famed quickness and capacity for learning. But the ill-educated part were angry with their sons when they saw them giving Cicero a place in the midst of them in the public roads by way of honor. Cicero, who had a talent such as Plato requires in a nature that loves learning and loves wisdom, for embracing all knowledge and undervaluing no kind of learning and discipline, happened to show a strong inclination to poetry. And indeed, a small poem of his is still preserved, which was written when he was a boy. It is entitled Pontius Glaucus, and is in tetrameter verse. In the course of time he applied himself to the muse of such arts with still more versatility, and got the reputation of being not only the first orator, but also the best poet among the Romans. Now his oratorical reputation continues to the present day, though there has been no small innovation in matters that concern eloquence. But as to his poetical reputation, owing to many poets of genius who have come after him, its fate has been to die away altogether, unknown to fame and unhonored. 3. After being released from his youthful studies, he heard Philo of the Academy, whom of all the scholars of Clitomachus the Romans admired most for his eloquence, and loved most for his manners. At the same time, by his intimacy with the Muci, who were statesmen and leaders in the Senate, he was aided in getting some knowledge of the law. And for a time also, he served in the army under Sulla, in the Marsic War. But seeing that matters were coming to a civil war, and from a civil war to a pure monarchy, betaking himself to a life of quiet and contemplation, he kept company with learned Greeks and applied himself to the sciences until Sulla had got the mastery, and the state seemed to have received a settlement. During this time, Chrysogonus, a freedman of Sulla, having laid an information about a man's property as being one of those who were put to death during the proscriptions, bought it for 2,000 drachmae. Roscius, the son and heir of the dead man, complained of this and showed that the property was of the value of 250 talents, on which Sulla, being convicted, was angry, and with the assistance of Chrysogonus, instituted a prosecution against Roscius for parricide. No one gave Roscius help, but all were deterred through fear of the severity of Sulla, on which the young man, in his desolate condition, had recourse to Cicero, who was also importuned by his friends, who urged that he would never again have a more splendid opportunity of gaining a reputation, nor a more honorable. Accordingly, Cicero undertook the defense and gained credit by his success. But being afraid of Sulla, he went into Greece, giving out that his bodily health required care. And indeed, he was lean and had little flesh, and owing to weakness of stomach, he took little food, and that of a light kind late in the day. His voice was full and good, but hard and unmanageable, and owing to the vehemence and passion of his language being continually carried through the higher notes, it gave him alarm about his health. 4. On his arrival at Athens, he became a hearer of Antiochus of Ascalon, being pleased with the easy flow of his speech and his graceful manner. But he did not like his doctrinal innovations, for Antiochus was now seceding from what is called the New Academy and deserting the sect of Carneades. Whether it was that he was influenced by the evidence and by the senses, or, as some say, through rivalry and differences with the followers of Clitomachus and the partisans of Philo, he was changing to be a cultivator of the Stoic principle in most things. But Cicero liked the other doctrines better and attached himself to them in preference, intending, if he should altogether be excluded from public affairs, to remove himself to Athens from the forum and public life and live there in tranquility with philosophy. But when news came that Sulla was dead, and his body, being strengthened by discipline, was attaining a vigorous habit, and his voice being now brought under management, had become pleasant to the ear and powerful, and was suitably adapted to his habit of body, and his friends from Rome were sending him many letters and exhortations, and Antiochus strongly urged him to engage in public affairs, he began anew to fashion his oratorical power, as if it were an instrument, and to rouse afresh his political capacity by exercising himself in the proper discipline and attending the rhetoricians of repute. Accordingly, he sailed to Asia and Rhodes, and among the Asiatic orators he attended the instruction of Xenocles of Adramyttium, and Dionysius of Magnesia, and Menippus of Caria, and in Rhodes the rhetorician Apollonius, the son of Molo, and the philosopher Posidonius. It is said that Apollonius, who did not understand the Latin language, requested Cicero to perform his exercises in Greek, and that Cicero readily complied, thinking that his faults would thus be better corrected. When he had finished his exercise, all the rest were amazed and vied with one another in their praises. But Apollonius, while he was listening to Cicero, showed no approbation. And when Cicero had finished, he sat for a long time, wrapped in thought. And as Cicero showed his dissatisfaction, he said, "You indeed, Cicero, I commend and admire, but I pity the fortune of Greece, seeing that the only excellent things which were left to us have been transferred to the Romans by you, learning and eloquence." 5. Now Cicero, full of hope in his course to a political career, had his ardor dulled by an oracular answer. For on consulting the god at Delphi how he might get most fame, the Pythia bade him make his own nature, and not the opinion of the many, his guide in life. At first he lived with reserve at Rome, and was slow in offering himself for magistracies, and was undervalued, being called Greek and pedant, names current among and familiar to the lowest citizens. But as he was naturally ambitious, and was urged on by his father and friends, he devoted himself to assisting persons in their causes, and he did not approach the highest distinction by gradual steps, but at once blazed forth in reputation, and was far superior to those who exerted themselves in the forum. It is said that he was as defective as Demosthenes in action, and that accordingly he carefully devoted himself first to Roscius the comedian, and then to Aesopus the tragedian. Of this Aesopus it is told that when he was representing on the stage Atreus deliberating how he should revenge himself on Thersites, and one of the servants suddenly ran past him, being transported out of his reason by his feelings, he struck the man with his scepter and killed him. Cicero derived no small power of persuasion from his action. He used scoffingly to say of the orators who bawled loud that because of their weakness they had recourse to shouting, like lame men leaping on horses. His readiness at sarcasm and other sharp sayings was considered well adapted to courts of justice and clever, but by overuse of it he gave offense to many and got the character of an ill-disposed person. 6. Being elected quaestor at a time of scarcity of corn, and having got Sicily as his province, he gave offense to the people at first by compelling them to send corn to Rome. But afterwards, when they had proof of his care and justice and mildness, they respected him, as they never had any governor before. And when many young Romans of good repute and noble birth, who were under a charge of neglect of discipline and bad behavior in the war, were sent up to the praetor of Sicily, Cicero pleaded for them in a remarkable manner, and gained their acquittal. Being accordingly greatly elated at all this, on his journey to Rome, as he tells us, a ludicrous incident happened to him. In Campania, falling in with a man of rank, whom he considered to be a friend of his, he asked him what the Romans said about his conduct in Sicily, and what they thought of it. Supposing that the city was full of his name and of his measures, and upon the man replying, "But where have you been all this time, Cicero?" he was completely dispirited that his fame was lost in the city, as in a boundless sea, and had produced no glorious result to his reputation. But on reflection, he abated much of his ambition, considering that he was striving for fame as for a thing indefinite, and one which had no attainable limit. However, all along there abided in him an exceeding love of praise and a strong passion for fame, which often disturbed much of his sound judgment. 7. But when he began to engage more actively in public concerns, he thought it a shame that artisans who make use of inanimate instruments and tools should be acquainted with the name of each and its place and use, and that the political man, whose public acts are affected by the agency of men, should be indolent and indifferent about the knowledge of his fellow citizens. Accordingly, he not only accustomed himself to remember persons' names, but he also knew the place in which every man of note dwelt, and the spot where he had his property, and the friends with whom he was familiar, and his neighbors. And whatever road in Italy he was traversing, Cicero could easily tell and point out the lands and houses of his friends. As he had only a small property, though sufficient and adequate to his expenses, he obtained credit by accepting neither pay nor presents for his services as an advocate, and most particularly by his undertaking the prosecution against Verres, who had been praetor of Sicily. Verres, who had been guilty of great malversation, was prosecuted by the Sicilians, and Cicero caused his conviction, not by speeches, but in a manner, as one may say, by not speaking at all. For as the praetors favored Verres and were putting off the trial to the last day by adjournments and tricks, and it was clear that the space of one day would not be sufficient for the speeches and the trial would not be brought to a conclusion, Cicero got up and said that the case required no speeches, and bringing forward the witnesses and taking their evidence, he told the judices to give their vote. Yet many lively sayings of his at that trial are recorded. The Romans call a castrated hog Verres. Now when a man of the class of Libertini, named Caecilius, who was under the imputation of Judaism, wished to put aside the Caeciliots and be the prosecutor of Verres, Cicero said, "What has a Jew to do with a Verres?" Verres also had a son grown up, who was reputed not to have regard to his youthful beauty, as a person of free birth ought to have. Accordingly, when Cicero was reviled for his effeminacy by Verres, he replied, "A man should find fault with his sons at home." The orator, Hortensius, did not venture directly to defend the cause of Verres, yet he was induced to give him his assistance when the damages were assessed, for which he had received an ivory sphinx as his reward. Upon Cicero saying something to him in an oblique way, and Hortensius replying that he had no skill in solving enigmas, Cicero answered, "And yet you have the Sphinx at home." 8. Verres being convicted, Cicero laid the damages at 75 10,000s, and yet he fell under suspicion of having lowered the damages for a bribe. However, the Caeciliots were grateful, and during his aedileship they came and brought many things from the island, from none of which did Cicero make any gain. But he availed himself of the men's desire to honor him so far as to cheapen the market. He possessed a fine place at Arpi, and he had an estate near Naples and another near Pompeii, neither of them large. He had also the marriage portion of his wife Terentia, to the amount of 10 10,000s, and a bequest which amounted to 9 10,000s of denarii. With these means he lived honorably and moderately, enjoying the company of the Greeks who were familiar with him, and of the Romans of learning. He rarely, if ever, lay down to table before sunset, and not so much because of his occupations as because of his health, which suffered much from the stomach. He was also exact and careful in other matters that concerned the care of his body, and he employed both friction and walking a fixed number of times. By thus regulating his habit of body, he maintained it free from disease, and equal to undergo many and great trials and labors. He gave up his father's house to his brother, and he fixed his own residence on the Palatine, in order that those who paid their respects to him might not be troubled by coming a great distance. And people used to come daily to his doors to pay their respects, no fewer than those who waited on Crassus because of his wealth, and on Pompeius because of his influence with the soldiers, which two were at that time highest in repute and chief of the Romans. Pompeius also courted Cicero, and Cicero's policy contributed greatly to the power and credit of Pompeius. 9. Though there were many candidates with him for the praetorship and men of note, he was proclaimed first of all, and he was considered to have discharged his judicial functions with integrity and skill. It is said that Licinius Macer, a man who of himself had great weight in the city, and who was also supported by Crassus, being tried before Cicero for peculation, was so confident in his power and the exertions made on his behalf, that while the Judases were giving their votes, he went home, and after cutting his hair with all speed, and putting on a clean dress, as if he had been acquitted, he was about to return to the forum. But on Crassus meeting him near the hall door and telling him that he was condemned by all the votes, he turned back, took to his bed, and died. And the circumstance brought Cicero credit for his careful administration of justice. Vatinius was a man whose manner was somewhat rough and contemptuous towards the magistrates when he was pleading before them, and his neck was full of swellings. On one occasion, when he was before Cicero, he made a certain demand, and as Cicero did not grant it forthwith, but deliberated some time, Vatinius said that he should not hesitate about it if he were praetor. On which Cicero quickly answered, "But I have not such a neck as you." While Cicero had still 2 or 3 days in his office, some person brought Manilius before him on a charge of peculation. But Manilius had the goodwill of the people and their zeal in his favor, as it was considered that he was attacked on account of Pompeius, whose friend he was. On Manilius asking for time, Cicero gave him only 1 day, which was the next, and the people were angry, inasmuch as the praetors were accustomed to allow 10 days at least to those who were accused. The tribunes also brought Cicero to the rostra and found fault with him, but he prayed to be heard, and he said that as he had always behaved to accused persons with forbearance and kindness, so far as the laws allowed, he thought it would be harsh not to do so in the case of Manilius, and accordingly he had purposely limited him to the only day which was at his disposal as praetor, for that to throw the trial into the period of another praetor's jurisdiction was not the part of one who was willing to help another. These words wrought a wonderful change in the people, and with many expressions of goodwill, they prayed him to undertake the defense of Manilius. Cicero readily undertook it, and chiefly for the sake of Pompeius, who was absent, and coming before the people, he again harangued them, in bold terms, censuring the oligarchical faction and the enviers of Pompeius. 10. Cicero was invited to the consulship, no less by the aristocratical party than by the many who for the interest of the state gave him their aid, and for the following reason. The changes which Sulla had introduced into the constitution at first appeared unreasonable, but now they seemed to the many by length of time and usage to have received a kind of settlement, and not a bad one, But there were those who sought to shake and change the present condition of affairs for the sake of their own gain, and not for the public good, while Pompeius was still fighting with the kings in Pontus and Armenia, and there was no power in Rome able to resist those who were for change. These men had for their head a bold and ambitious man of versatile temper, Lucius Catalina, who in addition to other great crimes had once labored under the imputation of unlawful commerce with his virgin daughter, and of murdering his own brother. And being afraid of being punished for this, he persuaded Sulla to proscribe his brother among those who were doomed to die, as if he were still alive. Him the evil-minded took for their leader, and they gave various pledges to one another, and among these they sacrificed a man and ate of his flesh. Catalina had corrupted a large part of the youth in the city by supplying every one of them with pleasure and banquets, and amours with women, and furnishing unsparingly the expense for all this. All Etruria was roused to revolt, and the greater part of Gaul within the Alps, and Rome was exposed to the greatest hazard of change on account of the inequality in properties, for those who had most reputation and lofty bearing had impoverished themselves by theatrical expenses and entertainments, and love of magistracies and building, and the wealth had all come into the hands of men of mean birth and low persons, so that things needed only a slight inclination, and it was in the power of every man who had courage for the thing to unsettle the state, which of itself was in a diseased condition. 11. However, Catalina, wishing to secure a stronghold, was a candidate for the consulship, and he was high in hope that he should be the colleague of Gaius Antonius, a man who of himself was not calculated to be a leader, either for good or bad, but one who would add force to another who was a leader. It was from seeing this that the majority of the honorable and the good encouraged Cicero to the consulship, and as the people readily seconded them, Catalina was rejected, and Cicero and Gaius Antonius were elected. And yet, Cicero alone of the candidates was the son of an equus, not of a senator. 12. Now the designs of Catalina still remained unknown to the many, but great struggles awaited the consulship of Cicero. For in the first place, those who by the laws of Sulla were excluded from magistracies, being neither weak nor few, became candidates and attempted to gain popular favor, and they made many changes against the tyranny of Sulla, which were indeed true and just, but yet they were disturbing the state of affairs at an unfit time and out of season. And in the next place, the tribunes brought forward measures to the same purpose, in which they proposed an administration composed of 10 men, with full powers, whose instructions were to have authority to sell the public property in all Italy and in all Syria, and all that had lately been acquired by Pompeius, to try whom they pleased, to send them into exile, to colonize cities, to take money from the treasury, and to maintain and raise as many soldiers as they might require. Accordingly, others of the nobles were in favor of the law, and especially Antonius, the colleague of Cicero, who expected to be one of the 10. It was supposed also that he was acquainted with the designs of Catalina, and was not averse to them on account of the magnitude of his debts, which chiefly gave alarm to the nobles. And this was the first object that Cicero directed his attention to, and he caused the province of Macedonia to be given to Antonius, and Gaul, which was offered to himself, he declined. And by these favors he gained over Antonius like a hired actor to play a second part to himself on behalf of his country. Now, when Antonius was gained and had become tractable, Cicero, being emboldened, opposed himself to those who were for making change. Accordingly, in the Senate, he made an attack upon the law, and so alarmed the promoters of it that they had nothing to say against him. When they made a second attempt, and being fully prepared, inviting the consuls to appear before the people, Cicero, nothing alarmed, bade the Senate follow him, and coming forward, he not only caused the rejection of the law, but made the tribunes give up even the rest of their measures and to yield to his overpowering eloquence. 13. For this man most of all showed the Romans what a charm eloquence adds to a good thing, and that justice is invincible, if it be rightly expressed in words, and that it befits him who duly directs political affairs, always in his acts to choose the good, instead of that which merely pleases, and in his speech to deprive what is useful of that which gives pain. And a sample of his persuasive eloquence was what happened in his consulship with respect to the public exhibitions. In former times, those of the equestrian class were mingled with the crowd in the theaters and were spectators among the people, just as chance would have it. But Marcus Otho, in his praetorship, was the first who, for the sake of distinction, separated the equites from the rest of the citizens, and gave them a particular place, which they still retain. The people took this as a disparagement of themselves, and when Otho appeared in the theater, they hissed for the purpose of insulting him. But the equites received him with loud applause. Again, the people began to hiss louder, and the equites to make still greater plaudits. Upon this they fell to abusing one another, and kept the theater in confusion. When Cicero heard of this, he came, and summoning the people to the temple of Bologna, both rebuked and admonished them, on which they went back to the theater and loudly applauded Otho, and vied with the equites in doing honor to the man and showing their respect. 14. The conspirators with Catalina at first crouched and were afraid, but they recovered heart, and assembling together, urged one another to take matters in hand with more courage before Pompeius returned, who was said to be now coming home with his force. Catalina was chiefly stirred up by the old soldiers of Sulla, who were planted all through Italy, but the greatest number and the most warlike of them were distributed in the Tuscan cities, and were again forming visions of robbery and plunder of the wealth that existed. These men, with Manlius for their leader, one of those who had served with distinction under Sulla, were on the side of Catalina, and came to Rome to assist at the Comitia. For Catalina was again a candidate for the consulship, and had resolved to kill Cicero in the tumult of the elections. The daimon also seemed to pre-signify what was going on by earthquakes and lightnings and sights. The information from human testimony was indeed clear, but not sufficient for conviction of a man of reputation and great power like Catalina. Wherefore Cicero deferred the day of election, and summoning Catalina to the Senate, questioned him about what was reported. Catalina, thinking that there were many in the Senate who were desirous of change, and at the same time wishing to make a display before the conspirators, gave Cicero an insane answer. What am I doing so strange, if when there are two bodies, one lean and wasted, but with a head, and the other headless but strong and large, I myself furnish it with a head." This allusion of his was to the Senate and to the people, which made Cicero more alarmed, and putting on his armor, he was conducted by all the nobles from his house, and by many of the young men, to the Campus Martius. And he purposely let the people have a glimpse of his armor, by loosing his tunic from his shoulders, and he showed the spectators there was danger. The people were enraged and rallied round him, and at last by their votes they again rejected Catalina, and chose Silanus and Murena consuls. 15. Not long after the men in Etruria came together to support Catalina, and were forming themselves into companies, and the appointed day for executing their plan was near, when there came to Cicero's house about midnight men who were among the first and most powerful in Rome, Marcus Crassus and Marcus Marcellus, and Scipio Metellus. And knocking at the door, and calling the doorkeeper, they bade him rouse Cicero, and tell him that they were there. And the matter was thus: after Crassus had supped, the doorkeeper gave him letters brought by some unknown man, which were addressed to different persons, and one to Crassus himself without a signature. Crassus, having read this letter only, and seeing that the letter intimated that there would be great bloodshed caused by Catalina, and that it urged him to quit the city, did not open the rest, but went forthwith to Cicero in alarm at the danger, and desiring to acquit himself somewhat of the blame which he bore on account of his friendship with Catalina. Accordingly, Cicero, after deliberating, convened the Senate at daybreak, and taking the letters gave them to the persons to whom they were directed, and bade them read the letters aloud. And all the letters alike gave notice of a conspiracy. When Quintus Arrius, a man of praetorian rank, reported the forming of armed companies in Etruria, and news arrived that Manlius with a large force was hovering about those cities, expecting every moment something new from Rome, a decree of the Senate was made to put affairs in the hands of the consuls, and that the consuls, on receiving this commission, should administer the state as they best could, and save it. The Senate is not used to do this frequently, but only when they apprehend great danger. 16. Cicero, upon receiving this authority, entrusted affairs out of the city to Quintus Metellus. He undertook the care of the city himself, and he daily went forth, guarded by so large a body of men that when he entered the forum, those who accompanied him occupied a large part of the ground, whereupon Catalina, no longer enduring delay, resolved to make his escape to Manlius, and he commissioned Marcius and Cethegus to arm themselves with swords, and going to Cicero's door in the morning, on pretense of paying their respects, to fall on him and kill him. Fulvia, a woman of rank, reported this to Cicero by night, and exhorted him to be on his guard against Cethegus and his associate. The men came at daybreak, and as they were not permitted to enter, they fell to railing and abuse at the doors, which made them still more suspected. Cicero, going out, called the Senate to the temple of Jupiter, the Stayer, whom the Romans call Stator, which is situated at the commencement of the sacred road, as you go up the Palatine. Catalina also came there with a rest to make his defense, but none of the senators would sit down with him, and all moved from the bench. Catalina began to speak, but he was interrupted by cries, and at last Cicero got up and bade him leave the city, for he said it was fit that as he was administering affairs with words and Catalina with arms, there should be a wall between them. Accordingly, Catalina immediately left the city with 300 armed men, and surrounding himself with fasces and axes as if he were a magistrate, and raising standards, he marched to Manlius. And as about 20,000 men altogether were collected, he visited the cities and endeavored to persuade them to revolt, so that there was open war, and Antonius was sent to fight with the now rebels. 17. Those who remained in the city of the persons who had been corrupted by Catalina were assembled and encouraged by Cornelius Lentulus Sura, a man of illustrious birth, but who had lived a bad life, and been already expelled from the Senate on account of his licentious habits. He was then praetor for the second time, as is the custom for those who recover the senatorial dignity. It is said that he got the name Sura from the following circumstances. In the times of Sulla he was quaestor, and lost and wasted much of the public money. Sulla was angry at this, and called him to account before the Senate. But Lentulus, coming forward in a very indifferent and contemptuous way, said that he had no account to give, but he offered his leg, as boys were wont to do when they had made a miss in playing at ball. From this he got the nickname of Sura, for the Romans call the leg Sura. Again, being brought to trial, he bribed some of the Judases, and was acquitted by 2 votes only, whereon he said that what he had given to one of the Judases was fairly wasted, for it was enough to be acquitted by a single vote. Such being the character of the man, and being stirred up by Catalina, he was further corrupted by the vain hopes held out by false prophets and jugglers, who recited forged verses and predictions, alleged to be from the Sibylline books, which declared that it was the law of fate that 3 Cornelii should be monarchs in Rome, 2 of whom had fulfilled their destiny, Cinna and Sulla, and that the daimon was come and had brought the monarchy to him, the 3rd of the Cornelii, and he ought by all means to accept it, and not to spoil the critical opportunity by delay, like Catalina. 18. Accordingly, Lentulus designed nothing small or trivial, but he determined to kill all the senators, and as many of the rest of the citizens as he could, and to burn the city, and spare nobody except the children of Pompeius, whom they intended to seize and keep in their power as securities for coming to terms with Pompeius. For already there was strong and sure report of his returning to Rome from his great expedition. A night had been fixed for the attempt, one of the Saturnalia, and they took and hid in the house of Cethegus swords and tow and brimstone. They also appointed 100 men, and assigned by lot as many parts of Rome to each, in order that by means of many incendiaries the city might be in a blaze in a short time on all sides. Others were to stop up the water conduits, and to kill those who attempted to get water. While this was going on, there happened to be at Rome 2 ambassadors of the Allobroges, a nation which, especially at that time, was in a bad condition and oppressed by the supremacy of Rome. The partisans of Lentulus, considering them suitable persons for stirring up Gaul to revolt, made them privy to the conspiracy. They gave these men letters to their Senate and letters to Catalina, promising liberty to the Senate, and urging Catalina to free the slaves and to march upon Rome. They also sent with them to Catalina one Titus of Croton to carry the letters. But inasmuch as the conspirators were unsteady men, who for the most part met one another over wine and in company with women, and Cicero followed up their designs with labor and sober consideration and unusual prudence, and had many men out of their body to keep watch, and to help him in tracking out their doings. And as he had secret conversation with many of those who were considered to be in the conspiracy and whom he trusted, he became acquainted with their communication with the strangers, and laying an ambuscade by night, he seized the man of Croton and the letters with the secret assistance of the Allobroges. 19. At daybreak, Cicero, assembling the Senate at the Temple of Concord, read the letters and examined the informers. Silanus Junius also said that some persons had heard Cethegus say that 3 consuls and 4 praetors were going to be killed. Piso, a man of consular rank, gave evidence to the same effect. Gaius Sulpicius, one of the praetors, being sent to the house of Cethegus, found there many missiles and arms, and a great quantity of swords and knives newly sharpened. At length, the Senate, having by a vote promised a pardon to the man of Croton on condition of his giving information, Lentulus, being convicted, abdicated his office, for he happened to be praetor, and laying down his robe with the purple hem before the Senate, assumed a dress suitable to the occasion. Lentulus and his associates were delivered up to the praetors to be kept in custody, but without chains. It was now evening, and the people in crowds were waiting about the temple, when Cicero came forth and told the circumstance to the citizens, by whom he was conducted to the house of a neighboring friend, for his own house was occupied by the women who were celebrating the mysterious rites to a goddess whom the Romans called Bona, and the Greeks call Gynecia. A sacrifice is made to the goddess annually in the house of the consul by his wife or his mother, in the presence of the Vestal Virgins. Cicero, going into the house, deliberated with a very few persons what he should do with the men, for he had some scruples about inflicting the extreme punishment, and that which was due to such great crimes, and he hesitated about it, both from the humanity of his disposition and because he feared that he might seem to be too much elated by his power and to be handling severely men who were of the highest rank and had powerful friends in the state, and if he treated them leniently, he dreaded danger from them. For he considered that they would not be well content if they were punished short of death, but would break forth in all extravagance of audacity and add fresh indignation to their old villainy, and that he should be judged a coward and a weak man, especially as the many had by no means a good opinion of his courage. 20. While Cicero was thus doubting, there was a sign to the women who were sacrificing. For though the fire seemed to have gone out, the altar sent forth from the ashes and burnt bark a large and brilliant blaze. This alarmed the women, except the sacred virgins, who urged Terentia, the wife of Cicero, to go with all speed to her husband, and tell him to take in hand what he had, and resolved on behalf of his country, for the goddess was displaying a great light to lead him to safety and honor. Terentia, who generally was not a woman of a mild temper, nor naturally without courage, but an ambitious woman, and as Cicero himself says, more ready to share in his political perplexities than to communicate to him her domestic matters, reported this to her husband, and stimulated him against the conspirators. In like manner, too, his brother Quintus and Publius Nigidius, one of his philosophical companions, whose advice he used in the most and chiefest of his political measures. On the following day there was a discussion in the Senate about the punishment of the conspirators, when Silanus, who was first asked his opinion, said that they ought to be taken to prison and suffer the extreme punishment. And all who spoke in succession acceded to this opinion, till it came to the turn of Gaius Caesar, who was afterwards dictator. Caesar, who was then a young man and in the very beginning of his rise to power, and already in his policy and his hopes, had entered on that road by which he changed the state of Rome into a monarchy, though he eluded the penetration of the rest, caused great suspicion to Cicero, without, however, giving him any hold for complete proof. But there were some heard to say that he came near being caught, and yet had escaped from Cicero. However, some say that Cicero purposely overlooked and neglected the information against Caesar through fear of his friends and his power, for it was plain to every man that the conspirators would rather become an appendage to Caesar's acquittal than Caesar would become an appendage to their punishment. 21. When then it came to Caesar's turn to deliver his opinion, he rose and expressed it against putting the men to death. But he proposed to confiscate their property and remove them to the cities of Italy, of which Cicero might approve, and there keep them confined till Catalina was defeated. The proposal was merciful, and the speaker most eloquent, and Cicero added to it no small weight. For when Cicero rose, he handled the matter both ways, partly arguing in favor of the first opinion and partly in favor of Caesar's, and all his friends thinking that Caesar's opinion was for the advantage of Cicero, for he would be subject to less blame if he did not condemn the men to death, chose the second opinion rather, so that even Silanus himself changed and made his explanation, saying that neither had he delivered his opinion for death, for that the extreme punishment to a Roman senator was the prison. After the opinion was given, Catulus Lutatius was the first to oppose it, and he was followed by Cato, who in his speech vehemently urged suspicion against Caesar, and so filled the Senate with passion and resolution that they passed a vote of death against the men. With respect to the confiscation of their property, Caesar made opposition, for he did not think it fair that they should reject the merciful part of his proposition and adopt the most severe part. As many of them made violent resistance, he invoked the tribunes, who, however, paid no attention to the call. But Cicero himself gave way and remitted that part of the vote which was for confiscation. 22. Cicero went with the Senate to the conspirators, who were not all in the same place, but kept by the different praetors. He first took Lentulus from the Palatine and led him through the sacred road and the middle of the forum, with the men of highest rank in a body around him as his guards, the people the while shuddering at what was doing and passing by in silence, and chiefly the youth, who felt as if they were being initiated with fear and trembling in certain national rights of a certain aristocratical power. When Cicero had passed through the forum and come to the prison, he delivered Lentulus to the executioner and told him to put him to death. He then took down Cethegus and every one of the rest in order and had them put to death. Seeing that there were still many members of the conspiracy standing together in the forum who did not know what had been done and were waiting for the night, supposing that the men were still alive and might be rescued, Cicero said to them in a loud voice, "They have lived." In these terms the Romans are used to speak of death when they do not choose to use words of bad omen. It was now evening, and Cicero went up from the forum to his house, the citizens no longer accompanying him, in silence or in order, but receiving him with shouts and clapping as he passed along, and calling him the Savior and founder of his country. And numerous lights illuminated the streets, for people placed lamps and torches at their doors. The women too showed lights from the roofs to honor the man, and in order to see him going home, honorably attended by the nobles, most of whom having brought to an end great wars, and entered the city in triumph, and added to the Roman possessions no small extent of land and sea, walked along, confessing to one another that the Roman people were indebted for wealth and spoils and power to many living commanders and generals, but for their security and safety to Cicero alone, who had removed from them so great a danger. For it was not the preventing of what was in preparation and the punishing of the doers which appeared worthy of admiration, but that he had quenched the greatest of dangers that ever threatened the state with the least evils and without disturbance and tumult. For most of those who had flocked to Catalina, as soon as they heard of the fate of Lentulus and Cethegus, left him and went away. And Catalina, after fighting a battle with those who remained with him against Antonius, perished, and his army with him. 23. However, there were some who were ready to abuse Cicero for this and to do him harm, and they had for their leader, among those who were going to hold magistracies, Caesar as praetor, and Metellus and Bestia as tribunes. Upon entering an office, while Cicero still had a few days in authority, they would not let him address the people, and placing their seats above the rostra, they would not permit him to come forward to speak. They told him that he might, if he chose, take the oath, usual on giving up office, and then go down. Upon this Cicero came forward, as if he were going to take the oath, and when he had procured silence, he swore not the usual oath, but one of his own, and a new oath, to the effect that he had saved his country and preserved the supremacy of Rome, and the whole people confirmed the truth of his oath. At this, Caesar and the tribunes, being still more vexed, contrived other cavils against Cicero, and a law was brought forward by them that Pompeius and his army should be recalled, on the pretext of putting down the power of Cicero. But Cato, who was then tribune, was a great help to Cicero and to the whole state, and he opposed himself to Caesar's measures with equal authority and greater good opinion. For he easily stopped other measures, and he so extolled the consulship of Cicero in a speech to the people that they voted to him the greatest honors that had ever been conferred, and called him the father of his country. For it seems that Cicero was the first on whom this title was conferred, upon Cato having so entitled him before the people.